Good morning and welcome to Principles of Microeconomics with James Bland. And throughout the course of this week, if you're playing at home, I've been running my class through Chapter 6 of Mankiw's Principles of Microeconomics, which is called Supply, Demand, and Government Policies. And in the last few videos, we've been learning about taxes. The situation we've been thinking about is that, in a market without taxes, we have a buyer and a seller. We have many of these, and the seller, if trade is mutually beneficial, is going to send goods this way, and the buyer sends money this way. However, when we introduce a government, whenever a trade happens, some money either comes from the seller to the government, so that's if a tax is levied on the seller's side of the market, or it comes from the buyer's side of the market, which is more the case in, say, sales tax in the US, where you take your item up to the cash register and you don't pay the sticker price, you pay the sticker price plus the tax. And then, really the seller collects your tax on your behalf, but the sticker price that you see is not the amount that you pay. And so when we introduce taxes, the numbers that sellers and buyers are going to be interested in are the price sellers receive and the price consumers pay, right? Because these things are the prices that buyers and sellers will be responding to, right? Buyers are interested in how much money do I need to give up to get this good, and sellers are going to be interested in how much money am I going to get if I sell my good. Okay, so just as a quick recap, let's have a look at what this looks like on a supply and demand diagram. Okay, so here we go. We've got supply and demand, and without taxes, we would have had this quantity be traded and this price traded. However, suppose that we implement, the government implements a tax on this market to the tune of $1 per item. Okay, so for every item that's sold in this market, the government collects $1. Now, in my previous video, we worked out that it doesn't matter which side of the market is taxed, the outcome is going to be the same. What we need to do is to find a point on the graph so that the vertical distance between the supply and the demand curves is equal to the value of the tax. And so that's going to look like this. If my screen will let me draw. There we go. Okay, so here's the value of the tax. And so what we can read off here, this is the intersection of our quantity with the tax. This point up here is the intersection with the demand curve, so that must be the price consumers pay. And then down here, we have the price sellers receive. Okay, and to think about this, the thing that's staying the same in this market is that buyers are buying the quantity that sellers want to sell. It's just that buyers and sellers are facing different prices, right? Buyers are thinking about the prices consumers pay, and sellers are thinking about the prices sellers receive. Okay? So when we think about this, compared to the situation before the tax, consumers are paying more, right? And they're paying more by this much, right? This is how much the price consumers pay rises by, right? So because before, the initial price was equal to the price consumers pay and the price sellers receive, because everyone was paying the same price, right? The government wasn't taking this bit out of the middle. Okay, so the price consumers pay has gone up, and the price sellers receive has gone down. Okay, so this is about where we left off in the previous video, and what we're going to do here is to find out under which circumstances does the price consumers pay go up by a lot more than the price sellers receive, and under which the price sellers receive goes down, and under what circumstances does the price sellers receive go down by a lot more than the price consumers pay have gone up. As you can see, if I've drawn it here, the tax looks like it's sort of equally shared between consumers and producers, but that's really just an accident of the way I've drawn these supply and demand curves, and if I drew some different supply and demand curves, this is not necessarily going to be the case. Okay, so what we're going to find out here is that all of this comes down to the relative elasticity of supply and demand. So what I'm going to show you here are a few diagrams with, relatively elastic supply and inelastic demand and so on. And there we're going to see that the tax burden is shared unequally depending on which of supply or demand is more elastic. Okay, so let's start out with our first diagram here. Price and quantity, and we're going to have relatively elastic demand. Okay, so let's have a supply curve that kind of looks like the one I drew before. And then if we have a relatively elastic demand curve, this means that consumers respond to prices a lot. Okay, so if price changes by a little bit, quantity demanded changes by a lot, which is represented in our diagram by a relatively flat demand curve, so something like this. Okay, so here is our initial quantity and our initial price, and now we're going to impose a tax. Okay, so again, the government collects a fixed quantity of money for every trade that happens, and so we're looking to drive a wedge between supply and demand that has a height equal to the value of the tax. So for the purposes of this diagram, let's put this in here. Here's the value of the tax, and so we have here is the price consumers pay, and here is the price sellers receive. Okay, and so what you notice with this diagram here is that the amount that consumers are paying, right, the price that consumers are paying, of course it's gone up because we've taxed the market, but it hasn't gone up by nearly as much as the price sellers receive have gone down. And to think about this, the quantity after the tax is implemented, here's the quantity with the tax, has to be such that quantity demanded is equal to quantity supplied, and if the demand curve is relatively flat, then the price consumers pay can't adjust by that much relative to supply. Okay, so suppliers here are going to see a much larger drop in prices than consumers are going to see increases in prices. Okay, so in this situation, we can say that producers pay most of the tax. Okay, so let's have a look at the other situation here where we'd have relatively elastic supply. we've got relatively elastic supply. Okay, so let's put a demand curve in here. And if we've got relatively elastic supply, then the supply curve is going to respond a lot to prices, which is represented here by a flat supply curve. I'm going to still draw it upward sloping, but it might look something like this. Okay, it's reasonably flat relative to the demand curve. Okay, so here, let's impose a tax. Actually, let's label the graph before equilibrium. How about that? So here's initial quantity. Here's the initial price. Now let's label the graph with a tax. So let's put a tax in, say, here. Now here is the price consumers pay. Here is the price sellers receive. Okay, now what we can see in this situation is that consumers have seen a very large increase in the amount of money they need to give up to get a good. But compared to this, sellers haven't seen that much of an adjustment in the price that they're receiving, right? The price they receive goes down by a bit, but not down by as much as the price consumers price consumers pay has gone up. So in this situation with relatively elastic supply, we have that consumers pay most of the tax. Okay, so remember, going back to the previous video, the result we arrived at was that it doesn't matter which side of the market the government taxes, the outcome is still going to be the same. And by that, we mean that we're going to get the same quantity with a tax, and the same price consumers pay, and the same price sellers receive, right? We could have implemented this tax either by taxing the demand side, in which case you'd be getting a demand curve coming through here. So this would be demand minus tax. Or we could implement this tax by taxing the supply side, in which case we'd have a supply curve coming through here, which would be supply plus the tax. Okay, so it doesn't matter which side of the market the government taxes, we're still going to get the same quantity and price consumers pay and price sellers receive, but what happens here is the market determines who really pays the tax. I'm going to write this down. The market determines who really pays the tax. Okay, so the government might be explicitly taxing one side of the market. For example, with sales tax in the US, you can think about that as being explicitly levied on buyers. Sometimes you have things like payroll tax, where explicitly workers pay some of that in the form of income tax, and companies pay some of that in terms of payroll tax. But it's the market who's going to determine it's the market that's going to determine who really pays that tax. And by that I mean how much the price consumers and producers pay and receive have gone up and down as a result of the tax. Okay, so the government can explicitly tax one or both sides of the market, but it's the market that's going to work out who sees the biggest changes in the price they're facing. Okay, thank you very much. I'm James Bland, and I will see you later.